My name is Frank Sullivan, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, I thought I was a good father. I worked hard, provided for my family, and raised my son James to be respectful, honest, and successful. When James became a lawyer and moved to the big city, I was the proudest father in Pennsylvania. I was wrong about everything. Have you ever loved someone so much that you ignored obvious signs they were embarrassed by you? Keep watching, because what I discovered about my successful son will break your heart and make you question everything you believe about family. For 20 years, I believed James was proud of his old man. For 20 years, I bragged to my neighbors about my lawyer son who had made something of himself. For 20 years, I was living in a fantasy, while my son treated me like a dirty secret he had to hide from his real life. But this was just the beginning of the most painful discovery a father could make. What I learned next would show me that love doesn't always mean respect. The day I found out the truth was the day I realized that success doesn't automatically make someone a good person. And sometimes the people who love you most are the ones you respect least. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how much I loved my boy before I tell you how much he hurt me. James was born in 1976, when I was 25 years, old and working at Bethlehem Steel. His mother Martha and I were young, broke, and happier than we had any right to be. We lived in a tiny apartment above my uncle's garage. But when I held that baby boy in my arms, I felt like the richest man in the world. This kid's going to have opportunities we never had, I told Martha that first night home from the hospital. He's going to college, he's going to wear suits to work, he's going to make something of himself. Martha smiled and kissed my forehead. Frank, as long as he's happy and kind, that's all that matters. But I wanted more than that for James. I wanted him to have the kind of life where he never had to worry about money, never had to choose between fixing the car and buying groceries, never had to tell his kids they couldn't afford something they needed. I worked double shifts at the steel plant to save money for James's education. Martha took in sewing to add to our college fund. We drove the same old Chevy for 15 years because every extra dollar went into that savings account. James was a smart kid. Not the smartest in his class, but smart enough, and more importantly, he was determined. He got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and never forgot to say please and thank you. Other parents would tell us how polite and well-mannered our son was. You and Martha raised him right, our neighbor Mrs. Henderson would say. That boy's going to make you proud someday. And I believed her. Every parents' night at school, every soccer game, every graduation ceremony, I was there in my work clothes, cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. When James was in high school, he started talking about becoming a lawyer. He'd watch legal dramas on TV and tell us about famous court cases he'd read about in the library. Lawyers help people get justice, he told us during dinner one night. They make sure the little guy doesn't get stepped on by big companies and corrupt politicians. I loved hearing him talk like that. My son was going to fight for people like us, working people who needed someone smart and educated to stand up for them. You're going to be a great lawyer, son, I told him, and I'm going to be there in the front row when you graduate law school. James smiled, but I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite identify at the time. When James graduated high school, he had earned a partial scholarship to Penn State. Martha and I used our entire college savings to cover the rest of his expenses. It was worth every penny to see our boy walking across that stage in his cap and gown. College was harder financially than we had expected. Even with the scholarship, James needed money for books, housing, food, and all the expenses that come with higher education. I picked up weekend shifts at the plant, and Martha started cleaning houses in the evenings. We'll manage, Martha would say when I worried about the bills. This is an investment in James's future. Someday he'll be successful enough to take care of us in our old age, but I never wanted James to feel obligated to take care of us. I just wanted him to be proud of where he came from and the parents who had sacrificed everything for his success. During his college years, James would come home for holidays and summer breaks. He'd tell us about his classes, his professors, and his plans for law school. But I started noticing that he was changing. The way he spoke was different, more formal, with bigger words and a more refined accent. The way he dressed was different, too. Polo shirts and khakis instead of the t-shirts and jeans he'd grown up wearing. College is really broadening James's horizons, Martha observed. He's becoming such a sophisticated young man. I was proud of James's transformation, but sometimes I felt like I was talking to a stranger instead of my son. When he came home, he seemed uncomfortable in our small house, critical of our simple meals, impatient with our conversations about work and neighbors. It's just a phase, Martha assured me. He's figuring out who he wants to be as an adult. He'll always be our James underneath. You think you know where this is going, but trust me, you don't. What I discovered about my son's true feelings was more hurtful than anything I could have imagined. James got into law school at the University of Pennsylvania, a prestigious program that cost more than I made in 2 years. Once again, Martha and I emptied our savings and took out loans to help him achieve his dreams. "This is it, Frank," Martha said the day we dropped James off at law school. "Our boy is really going to make it." During law school, James's visits home became less frequent. He said he was too busy with studies, internships, and networking events to come home very often. When he did visit, the conversations became even more strained. James would talk about his classmates, people with names like Bradford and Stephanie, whose parents were doctors, judges, and business executives. He'd mention restaurants I'd never heard of, cultural events I didn't understand, and career opportunities that sounded like they belonged in a different world. "Tell me about your friends," I'd ask, trying to connect with my son's new life. "You wouldn't know them, Dad," James would say dismissively. "They're from very different backgrounds." Something about the way he said different backgrounds made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't put my finger on why. After James graduated law school, he got a job at a big firm in Philadelphia. The starting salary was more than I had ever made. In my best year at the steel plant, Martha and I were so proud we could barely contain ourselves. "Our son is a real lawyer now," Martha would tell anyone who would listen. "He works for one of the most prestigious firms in Philadelphia." James rented an apartment in a nice part of the city and began what he called building his career. His visits home became even more rare, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, usually just for major holidays. When James was 28, he married Rebecca, a woman he'd met through work. She was also a lawyer from what James called a good family, meaning her parents had money and social connections. I was excited to meet Rebecca and welcome her into our family. But when James brought her home, for the first time I could see immediately that she was uncomfortable in our modest house. Rebecca was polite but distant. She complimented Martha's cooking with the kind of forced enthusiasm people use when they're trying to be nice about something they don't actually like. She asked careful questions about our town and our lives, but I could tell she was studying us like specimens in a laboratory. "Rebecca comes from a very different world," James explained privately. "Her father is a federal judge, and her mother sits on several charity boards. She's not used to this kind of environment." This kind of environment. My son was talking about his childhood home like it was a slum, instead of the house where he'd been loved and cared for every day of his life. But I pushed down my hurt feelings because I wanted James to be happy. If Rebecca made him happy, then I would find a way to like her too. James and Rebecca's wedding was held at a country club in Philadelphia. It was the fanciest event I had ever attended, with more flowers than I'd ever seen in one place and food served by waiters in white gloves. Martha bought a new dress for the occasion, the most expensive dress she'd ever owned. I rented a tuxedo that made me feel like I was playing dress-up. We wanted to look appropriate for our son's special day, but at the wedding, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. James introduced us to some of his colleagues and Rebecca's family, but the introductions were brief and awkward. He didn't tell stories about his childhood or share memories of growing up. He presented us like polite strangers he was obligated to acknowledge. When people asked what I did for work, James would quickly change the subject or steer the conversation in a different direction. When someone complimented Martha's dress, Rebecca would give her a tight smile and immediately start talking about something else. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere, even though you should have been welcomed with open arms? If you've ever felt out of place at your own child's important event, you know exactly how I felt. But what came next was so much worse. That's how I felt at my own son's wedding. After the wedding, James's visits home became even less frequent. He and Rebecca would come for Christmas dinner, stay for a few hours, and then drive back to the city. They never spent the night, even though we had prepared the guest room with new sheets and pillows. "They're very busy with their careers," Martha would say, making excuses for them. "Young lawyers have to work extremely hard to get ahead. When James and Rebecca had their first child, my grandson Tommy, I thought things would change. I imagined family visits where we could share our love for this new little person, where James would want his son to know his grandparents. But even with Tommy, the visits remained brief and formal. James would bring the baby for an hour or two, let us hold him and take a few pictures, and then pack up and leave. Tommy needs his routine," Rebecca would say. "He sleeps better in his own crib." As Tommy got older, I kept hoping James would bring him for longer visits. I wanted to teach my grandson how to fish, how to throw a baseball, how to fix things with his hands. I wanted to share stories about his father's childhood and show him the room where James had grown up. But those extended visits never happened. Tommy would come for Christmas morning, open his presents politely, and then leave with his parents for what Rebecca called their other commitments. By the time Tommy was in middle school, I realized I barely knew my own grandson. He was polite when we saw him, but there was no real connection between us. He seemed to view Martha and me as distant relatives rather than the grandparents who loved him desperately. "Maybe we could visit them in Philadelphia sometimes," I suggested to Martha. "See where they live, meet their friends." But whenever I mentioned visiting, James would find reasons why it wasn't a good time. His apartment was too small for guests. He and Rebecca were too busy with work. They had social obligations that wouldn't be interesting to us. Martha's health started declining when she was in her mid-60s. Heart problems, diabetes, the kinds of health issues that come with age, and a lifetime of hard work and stress. I called James to let him know about her doctor's appointments and hospital stays. "I'm sorry to hear that, Dad," James would say. "Let me know if there's anything I can do." But he never offered to visit, never asked if we needed help with medical bills or household tasks, never suggested that maybe his successful career could be used to make his aging parents' lives a little easier. When Martha died 3 years ago, James came home for the funeral. He gave a nice eulogy about what a good mother she had been, but he left immediately after the burial. No staying to comfort his grieving father, no helping to sort through Martha's belongings, no sharing memories of the woman who had sacrificed everything for his education. "I have to get back," James said. "I have a big case starting Monday." I stood in our empty house after the funeral, surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and sympathy cards from people who had loved Martha, and realized that my son had become a stranger. But this was just the beginning of my painful awakening. What I discovered over the next few months would show me that James hadn't just become distant. He had actively been hiding our relationship from his professional and social circle for 20 years. The revelation came 6 months after Martha's funeral in the most innocent way possible. I was at the grocery store when I ran into Carol Peterson, a woman who had moved away from our town 15 years earlier to live closer to her daughter in Philadelphia. Carol and Martha had been friends, and she had come back for the funeral. "Frank," Carol said when she saw me, "how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I told her. "Some days are harder than others." "I've been thinking about you and Martha a lot," Carol said. "And I have to tell you something that I found so touching." "What's that?" "Well, you know my daughter Lisa works for a law firm in Philadelphia. She was telling me about this lawyer at her firm who never talks about his family, never mentions where he comes from, always changes the subject when people ask about his background. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Lisa said the other lawyers used to joke that this guy must be in witness protection or something because he was so secretive about his past. They figured he must come from money but didn't want to seem privileged. "That's interesting," I managed to say. "But here's the touching part," Carol continued. "After Martha's funeral, Lisa saw this lawyer. His name is James Sullivan. She saw him crying in his office. When she asked if he was okay, he said he had just lost someone very important to him, but he couldn't talk about it. The grocery store suddenly felt too hot. I gripped my shopping cart to steady myself. Lisa said she was so moved by his obvious grief, even though he wouldn't share the details. She said it showed what a private, sensitive person he was. Carol was smiling, thinking she was telling me a heartwarming story about my son's emotional depth. But what she was actually telling me was that James had been hiding his family so completely that his colleagues didn't even know his parents existed. When Martha died, when the woman who had sacrificed everything for his success was lowered into the ground, James couldn't even acknowledge his grief publicly because that would have meant admitting he had a mother. Finished my shopping in a daze and drove home with Carol's words echoing in my head. James Sullivan, the successful lawyer who never talked about his family. The man who was so secretive about his background that his colleagues joked he must be in witness protection. My son was ashamed of me, ashamed of Martha, ashamed of where he came from and the people who had made his success possible. That night, I sat in my empty house and cried harder than I had since Martha's funeral. But these weren't tears of grief, they were tears of rage and betrayal. For 20 years, while I had been proudly telling everyone about my successful lawyer son, James had been pretending I didn't exist. As I sat there in the dark, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly how far my son's shame extended. I was going to learn the truth about how James Sullivan, the successful lawyer, had erased Frank Sullivan, the factory worker, from his life story. And then I was going to make sure he understood exactly what it felt like to be rejected by the person you loved most. The morning after my conversation with Carol Peterson, I woke up with a determination I hadn't felt since Martha's death. For months, I had been drifting through my days, missing my wife and feeling sorry for myself. But now I had a purpose. I was going to find out exactly how my son had erased me from his life. Before I tell you what I discovered, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to investigate your own child like they were a stranger? Have you ever had to become a detective? In your own family? I started where any father would start, by looking through the things James had left behind in his childhood bedroom. When James went to college, Martha had converted his room into a guest room, but she'd kept some of his belongings in boxes, in the closet. School yearbooks, old photos, awards and certificates from his childhood achievements. I sat on his old bed and went through those boxes, looking for clues about when my son had started to change. In his high school yearbook, James had written about his future plans. I want to become a lawyer who fights for working families like mine. I want to make sure people like my dad, who work hard their whole lives, get the respect and representation they deserve. People like my dad. Even as a teenager, James was already creating distance between himself and me. Not my dad or my family, but people like my dad. As if I was already becoming a category rather than a person. I found more evidence in the college letters he'd written home during his freshman year. Early letters were warm and personal. Dad, I miss your terrible jokes, and Mum, please send cookies. The food here is awful. But by his sophomore year, the tone had changed. The letters became more formal, more focused on his academic achievements, and less on missing home. By junior year, he rarely mentioned missing us at all. If you're thinking this is just normal growing up, wait until you hear what else I discovered about how systematically my son had rebuilt his identity. I decided to do some research about James's professional life. I wasn't sure how to investigate a successful lawyer, but I knew someone who might be able to help. My neighbor Tom Bradley had a son who worked in Philadelphia as a journalist. Tom's boy Danny had grown up with James, and I thought maybe he could tell me something about James's reputation in the city. Danny says your James has quite a reputation at that law firm, Tom told me when I asked. Very successful, very respected, but also very mysterious. Mysterious how? Well, Danny's covered some of the big cases James has worked on. He's tried to interview him a few times, but James always declines. Says he prefers to let his work speak for itself. That didn't sound like the James I had raised. The boy I knew loved to talk about his achievements and dreams. Has Danny ever met James socially, at any events or parties? Funny you should ask. Danny told me he saw James at a charity gala last year. Danny went up to say hello, two boys from the same hometown, but James acted like he didn't recognize him. My heart sank. What do you mean? Danny introduced himself. mentioned that their fathers were neighbors, said he remembered James from high school. James was polite but cold, said something like, "I think you have me confused with someone else," and walked away. James had denied knowing Danny Bradley, a boy he'd grown up with, played with, gone to school with for 12 years. Danny figured maybe James just didn't remember him, Tom continued. But later that night, Danny saw James talking to some colleagues, and he overheard James mention that he grew up in Connecticut and spent summers at his family's place in the Hamptons. Connecticut. The Hamptons. James had created a completely fictional childhood for himself, but you haven't heard the worst part yet. What I discovered next would show me that my son's shame wasn't just about hiding his past. It was about actively lying to build a false identity. I needed to know more about this fictional version of James's life, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. I know it sounds extreme, but I had to understand the full scope of what James had done. I found a retired police detective named Mike Torres who specialized in background investigations. I explained the situation and asked him to research my son's public persona. "Mr. Sullivan," Mike said when we met the following week, "your son has been very creative with his biography." Mike showed me printouts from James's law firm website, professional profiles, and social media accounts. According to these sources, James Sullivan had grown up in an affluent Connecticut family and was educated at prestigious private schools before attending Penn State on academic merit. His biography mentioned early exposure to legal concepts through family connections and a lifelong commitment to excellence instilled by successful parents. None of it was true, but it was all carefully crafted to sound impressive without being specific enough to verify. "Here's the interesting part," Mike continued. "Your son has been very careful never to lie about anything that could be easily checked. He doesn't claim to have attended private schools that don't exist, or to have parents with specific professions that could be verified. So he's been smart about his lying." Exactly. He's created what we call a soft fiction, a version of his background that sounds elite and privileged, without making claims that could get him in legal trouble. Mike showed me more evidence of James's fictional identity. Photos from social events where James was described as one of Philadelphia's rising legal stars from an established East Coast family. Quotes in legal journals where James discussed the advantages of growing up in an environment where intellectual achievement was valued above all else. "Mr. Sullivan, your son has spent 20 years building a professional identity based on denying your existence. This isn't just shame, this is systematic identity fraud." That evening, I called Rebecca's sister Lisa, whom I had met briefly at the wedding. I told her I was trying to get in touch with James for a family matter and asked if she knew the best way to reach him. "Oh, Frank," Lisa said, and I could hear surprise in her voice. "I didn't know James was in touch with his family." "What do you mean?" "Well, Rebecca has always told us that James is basically an orphan. She said his parents died when he was young, and he was raised by distant relatives who weren't close to him." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. "She said we were dead?" I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. But yes. Rebecca said James doesn't like to talk about his childhood because it was so difficult. She said he worked his way through college and law school completely on his own. While Martha and I emptied our savings and took out loans to pay for his education. "Lisa," I said carefully, "has Rebecca ever mentioned James visiting family or having any ongoing relationships with relatives?" "No, never. Rebecca says James is completely self-made, that he doesn't have any family connections or inherited advantages. She says that's what makes his success so impressive." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to process what I had learned. James hadn't just hidden his background from his colleagues, he had lied to his own wife about us. Rebecca believed Martha and I were dead. She believed James had achieved everything on his own, without any help or support from family. Tommy had grown up believing his father was an orphan who had overcome tragedy to become successful. My grandson didn't know his grandparents were alive because his father had told his mother we didn't exist. As I sat there in the house where James had been loved and cherished for 18 years, I realized the full scope of his betrayal. It wasn't just that he was ashamed of his blue-collar father and factory worker upbringing. He had actively erased us from existence to build a more impressive personal story. Put yourself in my position for a moment. How would you feel if you discovered your child had been telling people you were dead for 20 years? How would you respond to that level of rejection? But I wasn't done investigating yet. I needed to understand how deep this deception went, and whether there were other people James had hurt with his lies. I called Danny Bradley directly and asked if he could meet me for coffee. Danny was in his 40s now, a successful journalist, but he still remembered our neighborhood and the kids he'd grown up with. "Mr. Sullivan," Danny said when we sat down, "I have to tell you, running into James at that charity gala was one of the strangest experiences I've had." "Tell me about it." "Well, we were friends in high school. Not best friends, but we hung out sometimes, worked on the school newspaper together, went to each other's birthday parties. When I saw him at the gala, I was excited to catch up with someone from home." Danny stirred his coffee and shook his head, but when I approached him, it was like talking to a robot. He was polite, but there was absolutely no warmth or recognition. And when I mentioned you and Mrs. Sullivan, he got this look in his eyes. I can't describe it exactly, but it was like I was threatening him somehow. "What did you say about us?" "I asked how you were doing," said my dad had mentioned that Mrs. Sullivan had passed away. I offered my condolences. I felt my chest tighten. "What did James say?" "He said, 'I think you have me confused with someone else,' and walked away. But Mr. Sullivan, there was no confusion. I've known James since we were kids. I knew exactly who he was." Danny leaned forward. Later that night, I heard him talking to some colleagues about growing up in Connecticut. I wanted to correct him, to say, "No, James grew up right here in Pennsylvania. His dad worked at Bethlehem Steel," but something about his demeanor made me realize he was lying on purpose. "Did you ever try to contact him after that?" I thought about it. I even looked up his law firm and considered calling him. But honestly, Mr. Sullivan, the way he acted made it clear he didn't want anything to do with his past. I figured maybe he had his reasons. Danny paused and looked at me with sympathy. "I'm sorry if this is hard to hear. I always thought James was a good guy in high school. I can't understand why he would deny knowing you and Mrs. Sullivan." As I drove home from that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Martha's death. Pure rage. Not the sad, helpless anger of grief, but the focused fury of someone who had been deliberately and systematically betrayed. James hadn't just drifted away from his family or grown apart from his roots. He had made calculated decisions to erase us from his life and lie about our existence. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to force James to confront what he had done. I was going to make him choose between his fake identity and his real family. And I was going to do it in a way that would make him understand exactly how much damage his lies had caused. The plan started forming in my mind as I thought about everything I had learned. James had built his entire professional and social identity on the foundation of denying my existence. His success, his marriage, his reputation, all of it depended on the lie that Frank Sullivan had never been an important part of his life. But lies have a weakness. They can be exposed. And I was about to show my son what happens when a father decides to stop protecting his child from the consequences of their choices. I started by creating a social media account, something I had never done before, but figured I could learn. I posted photos of James as a child and teenager, with captions that told the truth about his background. My son, James Sullivan, at his high school graduation. So proud of this boy who grew up in our working-class neighborhood and earned his way to Penn State through hard work and family sacrifice. James at age 8, helping me fix our old Chevy in the driveway of our modest home in Pennsylvania. He always said he wanted to help working families when he became a lawyer. James with his mother Martha on Christmas morning 1995. Martha worked 2 jobs to help save money for James's college education. She died believing her son was proud of the sacrifices she made for his success. Each post included recent photos of James from his law firm's website, making it clear that the successful Philadelphia lawyer was the same person as the working-class kid from Pennsylvania. Within a week, my posts were being shared and commented on by people from our old neighborhood, James's former classmates, and eventually people who recognized James from his professional life. But this was just the beginning. What I did next would force James to confront 20 years of lies in the most public way possible. Have you ever had to expose someone you love in order to save your own dignity? Keep watching to see how a father's simple quest for acknowledgement became a reckoning that changed everything. Within 2 weeks of my social media posts going live, my simple quest to expose my son's lies had become something much bigger than I had expected. The photos of James as a child, combined with his current professional headshots, were being shared across multiple platforms. People from our old neighborhood were commenting with their own memories of James growing up. Former classmates were expressing shock that Jimmy Sullivan from Penn Avenue had become this mysterious Philadelphia lawyer who denied his past. But the real breakthrough came when Danny Bradley wrote an article about it. The lawyer who erased his past, a story about shame, success, and family, ran in Philadelphia magazine and included everything I had told Danny about James's deception, along with quotes from other people who had known James as a child. Before I tell you how James reacted, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting your own dignity? This was the hardest decision I'd ever made. The article went viral within 48 hours. Legal blogs picked it up, discussing the ethics of lawyers who misrepresent their backgrounds. Social media was buzzing with debates about class shame and family loyalty. Some people defended James, saying he had a right to reinvent himself. Others were outraged by his treatment of his parents. But the most important response came from James himself. 3 days after the article was published, my phone rang at 6 a.m. Dad. James's voice was shaking. We need to talk. Hello, James, I said calmly. Or should I call you the orphan from Connecticut? Dad, please, you don't understand what you've done. I understand exactly what I've done. I told the truth about my son's background, the son I'm supposedly too embarrassing to acknowledge. There was a long pause. Can I come see you today? You know where I live. Same house where you grew up. The one you've been pretending doesn't exist. James arrived that afternoon driving his BMW, dressed in an expensive suit, even though it was Saturday. He looked older than his 47 years, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at Martha's funeral. When he walked into our living room, the same room where he'd played with toys, done homework, and told us about his dreams, he looked around like he was seeing it for the first time. Dad, he said, sitting down carefully on our old couch, you've destroyed my career. Your career was built on lies, James. I just told people the truth. You don't understand the legal world. Reputation is everything. Clients hire lawyers they trust, and trust is based on authenticity. Authenticity, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. James, you told your wife I was dead. You told your colleagues you grew up in Connecticut. You told charity event organizers. You were raised by wealthy parents. Where's the authenticity in that? James put his head in his hands. I know how it looks, but you don't understand the pressure I was under. Pressure from whom? Your mother and I never pressured you to be ashamed of us. Not pressure from you, pressure from them. From the legal community. From Rebecca's family. From clients who expect their lawyers to come from certain backgrounds. So you decided the easiest solution was to pretend we didn't exist. James looked up with tears in his eyes. Dad, do you know what it's like to walk into a room full of lawyers whose parents are judges and senators and business owners, and have to explain that your father worked in a steel mill? No, James. I don't know what that's like, but I know what it's like to work in a steel mill to pay for your son's education and then have that son pretend you never existed. The words hit James like a physical blow. He started crying in earnest. Now, but I felt no sympathy. The time for sympathy had passed 20 years ago. I never meant for it to go this far, James sobbed. It started small, just not mentioning details about home. But then people started making assumptions, and it was easier to let them believe what they wanted to believe. And when did those assumptions become outright lies? When did I become a dead parent instead of just an unmentioned one? James wiped his eyes. When I started dating Rebecca. Her family kept asking about my background and I panicked. I said my parents had died when I was young because I thought it would explain why I didn't talk about family. And you never thought about how that lie would affect your actual living parents? I thought, I thought I could keep the two parts of my life separate forever. James looked around the room again, taking in the old furniture, the family photos. On the mantel, the modest decorations that had made our house a home. Dad, I know I hurt you and Mum terribly. I know what I did was wrong. But please, can't we find a way to fix this quietly? Can't we work something out that doesn't destroy everything I've built? Put yourself in my position. Your son is begging for forgiveness, but he's still more concerned about his reputation than about the pain he's caused. What would you do? James, tell me about Tommy. What does my grandson know about his grandparents? James looked uncomfortable. Tommy thinks. Rebecca told him that my parents died in an accident when I was in college. So my grandson has been grieving grandparents who are actually alive. He's been feeling sorry for his father's tragic orphan story, while his real grandfather was sitting in this house, hoping for a relationship with him. Dad, I can explain everything to Tommy. I can tell him the truth. What truth? That his father is a liar who was ashamed of his own family. That's a hell of a thing for a 16-year-old to learn about his role model. James stood up and started pacing around the room. What do you want from me, Dad? What will it take to make this right? I want you to stop lying. I want you to tell your wife, your son, your colleagues, and your clients the truth about where you came from. I can't do that. It would ruin me professionally. Then you've made your choice. You've chosen your fake identity over your real family. James stopped pacing and looked at me with desperation. Dad, please, there has to be another way. There is another way, James. You can start being proud of where you came from instead of ashamed of it. How can I be proud of growing up poor? How can I celebrate the fact that my parents struggled financially their whole lives? Because your parents' struggles are the reason you succeeded. Because Martha and I sacrificed everything to give you opportunities we never had. Because working-class parents who send their children to college are heroes, not embarrassments. James sat back down and stared at the floor. I never thought about it that way. That's because you've spent 20 years running away from the truth instead of embracing it. Over the next hour, James and I had the most honest conversation we'd had since he was a teenager. He told me about the pressure he felt in law school, surrounded by classmates who took their privileges for granted. He told me about the fear that his blue-collar background would limit his career opportunities. He told me about the shame he felt when he couldn't afford the same clothes, restaurants, and social activities as his wealthy classmates. I understand all of that, James. I said when he finished, but none of it justifies lying about your mother's death. None of it justifies denying my existence. None of it justifies robbing Tommy of a relationship with his grandfather. James was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happens now, Dad? How do we move forward from here? That depends on you, James. Are you willing to tell the truth publicly? Are you willing to correct the lies you've told and introduce your family to your real life? It will be humiliating. Not as humiliating as spending the rest of your life lying about the people who love you most. James looked around the room one more time, and I saw something change in his expression. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked at our modest home with something other than embarrassment. Mum really did sacrifice everything for my education, didn't she? Every penny, every extra hour of work, every cheap dinner so we could save money for your future. And I repaid that sacrifice by pretending she never existed. Yes, you did. James stood up and walked over to the mantel, where photos of his childhood and Martha's life were displayed. He picked up a picture of himself at age 10, grinning, gap-toothed in his Little League uniform, with Martha and me beaming proudly behind him. I used to love this picture, he said quietly. Your mother looked at that picture every day until she died. James set the photo down and turned back to me. Dad, I want to make this right. Not just for my career, but because it's the right thing to do. What does that mean specifically? It means I'm going to tell Rebecca and Tommy the truth. It means I'm going to correct the record with my colleagues and clients. It means I'm going to stop running away from who I really am. And it means you're going to bring Tommy here to meet his grandfather properly. Yes, he should know where he comes from. He should know about the grandmother who loved him before he was even born. James paused and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for 20 years, respect. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for being ashamed of you and Mom. I'm sorry for lying about our family. I'm sorry for wasting 20 years being something I'm not. I accept your apology, James, but apologies don't undo 20 years of hurt. You're going to have to prove you've changed through your actions, not just your words. James nodded. I understand, and Dad, I want you to know that some of my happiest memories are from this house. This room, this neighborhood, the life you and Mom built for me. I don't know why I thought I had to run away from that happiness. Fear makes people do stupid things, son, but courage can make them do better. 6 months later, James published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer titled "The Lies We Tell, A Lawyer's Confession About Class, Shame and Family." In the article, James told the complete truth about his background, his parents' sacrifices, and his decision to hide his family for 20 years. He wrote about the pressure young professionals feel to present perfect backgrounds and the damage that shame can do to families. I spent 2 decades pretending my parents didn't exist, James wrote, because I was afraid their working-class background would hurt my career. Instead, denying them hurt my soul. I robbed my son of knowing his grandparents, and I robbed myself of the pride I should have felt in their sacrifices. The response to James's article was overwhelmingly positive. Other lawyers shared their own stories about hiding modest backgrounds. Clients wrote to say they respected James more for his honesty than they ever had for his fake sophistication. Most importantly, Rebecca and Tommy responded with understanding rather than anger. "I wish you had trusted me with the truth from the beginning," Rebecca told James. "I fell in love with who you really are, not some fictional version of yourself." Tommy was hurt initially, but his 16-year-old resilience helped him adapt to the revelation that his grieving father's story had been a lie. "It's actually cooler that Grandpa Frank is alive than that he died tragically," Tommy told me during his first real visit to my house. "Dead grandparents can't teach me how to fix cars or tell me stories about Dad being a knucklehead as a kid." Today, 2 years after that confrontation in my living room, my relationship with James is better than it's been since he was in high school. He visits regularly, brings Tommy for extended stays, and talks openly about his childhood and family. His career not only survived his public confession, but actually improved. Clients appreciate his authenticity, and his legal colleagues respect his courage in telling the truth about his background. "You know what's funny?" James told me during a recent visit. "Some of my biggest clients are other working-class people who made it big. They hire me specifically because I understand what it's like to come from nothing and build something. At 72 years old, I've learned that love isn't always enough to maintain family relationships. Sometimes you have to fight for the respect and acknowledgement you deserve, even from the people you love most. I also learned that shame is a choice. James chose to be ashamed of his background for 20 years, and that choice nearly destroyed our family. But courage is also a choice. When James finally chose to tell the truth, he discovered that his real story was more powerful than any lie he had invented. If this story taught me anything, it's that you can't build a meaningful life on the foundation of denying the people who made that life possible. James spent 20 years running from Frank Sullivan, the factory worker, only to discover that Frank Sullivan's son was the best thing about his identity. Today, when James introduces me to his colleagues, he doesn't mumble apologetically about his blue-collar father. He says, "This is my dad, Frank Sullivan. He worked at Bethlehem Steel for 30 years and sacrificed everything to send me to college. I'm the lawyer I am today because of the values he taught me." And when I hear those words, I feel the pride I should have been feeling for the past 20 years. Not pride in my son's success, but pride in my son's character. Because success without character is just an expensive lie. But character with success? That's something worth celebrating. And after all these years, James Sullivan the lawyer has finally become someone that Frank Sullivan the factory worker can be proud to call his son.